Hello, I'm Iddo Tavory. I'm here at the Magnus Museum at Berkeley to speak about my new book about Orthodox life in Los Angeles. I hope you join me.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody here. If you could take your seats. I am Claude Fisher. I am a professor of sociology at Berkeley, and I'm also on the board of the Center for Jewish Studies. This talk, as many others, is sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies. Many of the chairs you're sitting on have cards with information about Center for Jewish Studies programs in the future, and also about the general mission of the Center for Jewish Studies, and we also are looking, of course, for support from the public for further programs of this kind. I'm pleased to serve as the introducer here to Professor Iddo Tavory, who will speak about his book entitled Summoned, and he'll explain what he means by that word, summoned. It's a study of the strict Orthodox living in Los Angeles in the Melrose, Beverly, La Brea area. And I think all of us have some fascination with this topic, and we're going to learn a lot about it. Iddo is an extremely accomplished scholar. He received his BA from Tel Aviv University, his PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles. He is the author of many publications and many articles on a variety of topics, some of them quite esoteric. One I will mention, with our own Ann Swidler, professor of sociology at Berkeley. Iddo wrote a paper on condom use in Malawi. Now, it's a half a world away from the corner of La Brea and Beverly Boulevard, but you'll see perhaps some connection in terms of his ability to understand the way in which people make sense of the cultures in which they live. He'll discuss his 5 years of research in that area when he was deeply embedded in the community of the strict Orthodox. He was so deeply embedded that, if I understand the story correctly, they tried very hard to set up a shidduch for him. They did not succeed. And as you can see, they also did not succeed in making him wear a kippah all the time. Many aspects of Iddo's study are fascinating. I'll just mention one angle for me. In a world where everyone is declaring that the rise of secular life is erasing, in many ways, the power of religion, here in this community is a thriving, growing, and in some ways increasingly religious community. How is this possible? In the middle of what looks to most people like Sodom and Gomorrah, if you go to West LA, there is this thriving, strict Orthodox community. It also happens to be my mother's neighborhood. And so on Shabbat, you can see a mix of would-be starlets jogging down the street wearing almost nothing, running right past a family of strict Orthodox and talits and baby carriages and so forth. How is this possible? What is happening? Iddo will tell us. Thank you.
So thank you for this very gracious introduction. So I'm going to talk about my book, Summoned, Identification and Religious Life in a Jewish Neighborhood. And let me start with the puzzle, and I think Claude beat me to the punch with that, but here's the puzzle. You have the largest, okay, sorry. Can you hear me better? Okay, thank you. You have the largest and most vibrant, strict Orthodox neighborhood, and I call them strict Orthodox because when I called them ultra-Orthodox, they were very unhappy with that. Like, ultra, I'm not sure about that. In west coast of the United States is situated on the Melrose La Brea neighborhood. So it's this area of Beverly, Melrose, La Brea, one of two major neighborhoods in Los Angeles, the other being Pico Robertson. But it is the kind of center of what we would think of as the Haredi community, the strict Orthodox. But it is situated on the Melrose La Brea neighborhood, and I don't know if you had the ill fortune of seeing the show Melrose Place, which played for a while, but that is not exactly where you expect to see an Orthodox neighborhood thriving. It's known for transgressive youth culture, tattoo parlors, would-be starlets, and wannabe actors running down the streets. And yet this place, in terms of organizational life, really since the 70s and 80s and increasing until today, has become a hub of activity. In terms of organizational life, there's 24 synagogues, In rough estimations, because there are all these little minions in some rabbi's backyard that always pop up and go down, there are 5 private schools that are thriving and admitting students from all over Los Angeles. There's a yeshiva, which brings students from Australia, South Africa, England, New York, 2 kollels for adult education, and the list goes on organizationally. And in terms of population, though it's hard to know without really going door to door with a census, it's about 4,000 residents, about 800, 900 households, and the number of households and organizations is only growing. And to give you an idea of this kind of incongruence, here's a picture of Melrose. And of course, I mean, those of you who know LA well will realize that there's a trick in this picture, because the main thoroughfares in LA, because of the zoning laws, are where all the stores are and all the businesses are. In LA, once you kind of walk 2 meters beyond the main thoroughfares in the kind of small streets, it becomes this kind of quiet, quaint neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, though, and all the organizations actually are on these thoroughfares, you have this thriving community. And the question that I set up to study is, how do they sustain a religious life? And not only sustain a religious life, but thrive within and even through this modern settings. And what I landed on as a metaphor that I'm going to repeat, so I should talk about, is the notion that I called summoning as an organized metaphor. So it's not simply that people are religious and that they think it's important. They do, and they are. But it's also that they're constantly called into being. They're constantly reminded who they are. They're constantly pulled into Orthodox life. And the question then becomes, how are they constantly reminded of who they are? And how does a social world around them, in some sense, scaffold what their identity is, allow them to be Orthodox Jews in that particular way? And that's the overarching narrative that I'm going to talk about today. What are the processes or pattern forms of interactions that pull people in? And how do these processes become what I think of an extremely dense, almost viscous world of summoning, a world in which you're constantly pulled in? So how do I know how do you know that I know what I'm talking about? My work is mainly based on participant observation. Hang out with people, I take notes, take as good notes as I can, which I have to say was somewhat hard in the Orthodox neighborhood sometimes, because writing, of course, is not allowed on the Sabbath. And so I had to make allowances for faulty memory on my Sabbath, because I decided that it was more important to respect what they stood for than to have better field notes, and my notes suffered. But I spent 5 years of participant observation, in which I came there in the beginning 4 times a week, and then in the second year of my study I moved in. I rented a back house, a kind of garden house of an Orthodox family, kind of little bedroom that was actually better than my student dorms, so that was all right. And the same price they gave it to me. Nobody asked for my credit score, but everybody asked where I daven by. Now, my point of view here is important, I think. I'm Jewish, which allowed me to do this study. A woman before me has tried to study the same neighborhood. She was of German origin, called Margaret Kusenbach. And in the beginning, people were very accepting of her until they realized she's the wrong kind of German. And then it was completely blocked. But of course, as a Jew, and especially since I got entry through Chabad, and Chabad sees their mission as bringing Jews back to the fold, it was almost effortless. I'm from Israel, which means that I speak Hebrew, which was very, very useful. And I can read Hebrew, and through the years got a okay grasp of Aramaic. And I was raised secular, again, secular in the kind of Israeli sense, in which I really didn't know anything about religion, and that was part of why I got so fascinated was that I walked into this synagogue and everybody accepted me. And for me, as a secular Israeli, it seemed like a minor miracle. 2 years down the line, I thought I was so naive, but at that moment, it was part of the draw. It means that most people thought me as a Baal Tshuva, as somebody who's going to become more Jewish as part of their involvement. They were very, very disappointed when I was not a good Baal Tshuva. They really did try to marry me off multiple times in the hopes that, maybe something will tilt me. It also means that most of my observations are with men here, and that's it's important. So even though some of my best friends in the neighborhood were women, and I had very intimate conversations with them that I didn't think that I could really have about things like childbearing and sex. It was still, especially organizationally, I was really inducted into a men's world. I also interviewed people to understand the histories of synagogues, how rabbis saw their synagogue goers, how many people they saw, how they thought about membership. And I did some archival work to figure out how the neighborhood sprung into being. So let me start here with an image, kind of impressionistic image that sociologists sometimes like to draw, which is the ways in which people are tied to organizations in the neighborhood. So saying that there's a lot of organizations in a neighborhood actually tells you very little about the neighborhood, right? Because maybe there's tons of organizations, but you only go to one. So the fact that there are a lot of organizations in itself tells you very little. So what I did was, using my notes and 5 years of kind of coding who goes where when, I tried to figure out, okay, if you go to one synagogue, what other synagogues do you go to? Where do you send your kids to school? Which mikveh do you use, right? Which ritual bath? What lessons do you learn? What shiurim? And then I got this map, which is a little bit, looks like a kind of abstract, some kind of early 20th century painting. But I think it tells us a few interesting things that I want to start talking about. So first of all, of course, and you know it, and it's nice to talk to people who are not sociologists, but are actually within the Jewish world, there's no such thing as an orthodoxy. It's made out of all these little sub-affiliations. There's Chabad, and there's Hasidish that is not Chabad, and there is Litvish that is really, really not Chabad and really not Hasidic, and then there's Sephardic, and then there's the kind of older immigrant orthodoxy that is petering off but still exists quite strongly, and then there's the modern Orthodox, who are a creature unto themselves. So what you see here, and the colors are these different sub-affiliations of orthodoxy. And what you can see is that the sub-affiliations are clustered together. So for example, the yeshivish, right, the blue here, is clustered together, and it means that when people go to one yeshivish synagogue, they tend to send their kids to a yeshivish school, and to go to the yeshivish shiurim, and to live within their world. But you also see a couple of things. First of all, you have institutions that belong to multiple affiliations, right? So you have ritual baths, for example, and the main ritual bath in the neighborhood, everybody went there, right? So that brought people together from different places. There was a volunteering organization, a Tomchei Shabbos, kind of a Sabbath organization for the needy, and people volunteered across different affiliations. So you had these, but you also had a lot of ties in between, which means that, yes, people, for example, belonged to Chabad, but they knew that the really good school is not the Chabad school. And because they had aspirations for their children, religious aspirations, they might have sent them to a different school. And really, they liked the rabbi in a different place. And so what you really had was a neighborhood in which people belonged to multiple organizations. And people were constantly embedded in all these organizations and were, as I'm going to talk about, summoned by all these organizations. Now, again, these kind of maps are nice and aesthetic, but they tell you very little about the texture of people's lives. So let me zoom in a little bit on just one aspect that is, I think, very well known, which is synagogue life, and how people get summoned in synagogue life. So what I'm going to talk about is teamwork. So we know we need 10 men for a minyan in the Orthodox world. Now, in a large synagogue, that's not a problem. You have this Hanetz minyan when the sun only rises, the 6 o'clock minyan, the 6:30 minyan, the 9:30 minyans for the really late risers. So there's a hub of activities. But in the neighborhood, and that's true, I think, for other neighborhoods that I looked at, Orthodox neighborhoods, and I can talk more why that is if you want to ask me in the Q&A. Actually, most synagogues are very small synagogues. They have enough people on the Sabbath. But during the week, it's actually really hard to get a minyan. It's really hard to get 10 men at 6:30 in the morning, which is when prayers start. So how do you do that? And what happens is that the rabbi starts having to know where everybody is. So one day I get a call, and it's the synagogue rabbi in the main synagogue I went to, and he's like telling me, Iddo, can you make sure you make it this week? Because David is going on a business trip to Europe, and we know we might have a problem. Can you please just make sure you come? So, of course I come. And so I realized that the rabbi actually has to constantly track where different people are and how the minyan is going to look at, because otherwise he's not going to have a minyan, and that's a disaster, right? I mean, because people are going to wait, they're going to be late for their jobs, they're going to be stuck in traffic in LA, which is really awful. So you have that. But then also, when about 6:36, if there's not enough people, people get antsy, right? So somebody has everybody's phones, and they start texting, calling. So this is a text that I got one morning at 6:36. Hi, I would like to join us for our almost minyan, big rewards, which probably means the afterlife. And people are constantly doing that, right? So it's not only even that the rabbi is tracking everyone, but people have to keep each other accountable for where they are, because it becomes, in a very real sense, it becomes teamwork. And each member of the team is important. Now, this is true for all members. Of course, for some members, it's truer than for others. So, for example, you have the Kohen and the Levi, right? Mondays, Thursdays, Sabbath, the high holidays. You need a Kohen and a Levi for certain blessings. And if you don't have a Kohen, you have to say, Ein kan Kohen, right? There is no Kohen here. Well, that's all right in a big synagogue, that's not a problem. But in a small synagogue like this one, that's a huge problem, because there's two Kohens. There's Jeremy and there's David, right? So Ein kan Kohen doesn't just mean there is no Kohen here. It's Jeremy and David didn't make it, and they know it. So one day I meet Jeremy early in the morning, and he looks like he could really, really use some more sleep, and I comment on that. And he looks at me and is like, I'm a Kohen. I have to come, right? Again, so this is places in which it creates exasperation. It creates moment that people actually are trying to avoid. But it's also a moment of elation. So if, again, another person that I knew that lived in the valley and is a very, very shy guy, very awkward in interaction, told me once really, really gladly how, because there's so few strict Orthodox Kohens in the valley, he got calls months in advance from synagogues to try to secure him, and he was kind of like, I'm a Kohen for hire, right? And that's the kind of other side of that coin, right? The other side of that coin, that you are personally needed, that you are personally brought into communal life. It's not just that there's ritual, that people are hanging together, it's that you personally are brought in. And that's one aspect, and you can even think about the structure of liturgy itself, right? There's the structure of prayer as doing something like that. Because, of course, most prayer is just everybody is saying it, and in a strict Orthodox synagogue, everybody is saying it in a different pace, and just kind of everybody's mumbling it to themselves as they pace around. The synagogue, it used to be everybody with a siddur. Today, it's a lot of people on their iPhones are kind of scrolling down and praying. But of course, there are also moments that are only said only if. And these moments tell people something about what other congregants are dealing with and what's going on. So here's one moment that occurred to me in the morning prayers. Goldman, one of the people stands up, goes to the Torah and recites the Gomel, right? Said when one crosses a great sea, get well after a threatening illness, survives life-threatening experience. And as he's reciting it, right, it's part of everybody's kind of half asleep. It's the morning, it's about 6:45. Suddenly everybody perks up and looks up, looking up from the prayer book, from the Sidurim exchange glasses. After the prayer, just a flurry of congregants approach him because they know that he wasn't very sick. And, he was on vacation, they know that, but something serious had happened, right? So they approach him, and he's kind of relishing that he's become the center of attention. He says that he was coming back from vacation in Arizona with his wife, and the wheels on the plane at LAX wouldn't open, and they were circling around the airport for a while. And then when the gasoline was so low, and he was very dramatic about it, that it was land or drop, and they descended, and it turned out the wheels were operational, and didn't show up on the pilot's screen. But both he and his wife were thoroughly shaken, and she kissed the ground and thanked God. So it's a small moment, but life is full of these small moments. And these small moments tell congregants who the other congregants are and pull them into interaction. Because even if you don't know Mr. Goldman well, if you pray with him every morning and he suddenly recites the Gomel, you have to know what happened. Like, what kind of person wouldn't ask what happens? So people are, again, propelled into interaction and propelled into that kind of social life. Now, this is just a couple of moments in one synagogue, but if you think back about this map, you start to get a sense of all the ways in which people are pulled in. So another, again, and just to take another example, if you think about schools, so schools everywhere are very greedy. Right? They pull people in, both the parents and the children. But schools in the Orthodox world make very, very specific demands. All the schools are private. The cheapest school there cost, when I was doing it, $11,000 a year, which is not that terrible. But if you think about people who have 7, 8 kids, you're talking about an incredible amount. You're talking about people sending their entire salaries, but more or less into the schools when they have kids. You had to sign a contract that said you had no TV in the house, that the mother wears a wig, that you keep the Sabbath. You also, couple of the schools had to sign a contract that said that you don't own a dog, because that's a goyish thing to have, and there's a Kabbalistic thing about impurity of dogs. Actually, the household that I was at, they had a dog, and they were very, the school tried to make them throw away the dog, and they resisted it. And the reason they managed is they were one of the only people who paid the entire tuition. And so the school was like, but they still called their dog Muki, which was short for Muktzeh, right? The dog was kind of like religiously slightly profane, but still part of the family. So these are kind of ways in which the schools pull people in, and of course most parents actually couldn't pay $11,000 a year, so they got all these tuition reductions. But getting tuition reductions also came with a cost. They were brought in even more into the school, organizing pizza nights in the one kosher pizza place that everybody could agree on, taking kids to school, doing all these kind of activities. So we're pulled into the schools. And for kids, of course, I mean, school is always the center of the world, but for kids, it was both important in itself, but also they knew that the schools, and especially high schools, and especially for women, for girls, were extremely important, because girls get married when they're 20, 21, and they get married through shidduch. So who do you ask? The principal of the school. And girls that I talked to were terrified. And actually, I interviewed one of the principals in one of the schools, and he had a closed camera TV circuit, and he could see the girls. And at some point, he gave one a jolt not in the classrooms, that's illegal, but in the halls, that is actually legal. And he just was like, "Leah, what are you doing?" She was on the speaker. And it's pretty terrifying for these women. I mean, it's a complex relationship. I think he was also a kind of beloved authority figure. But it was also terrifying, and one of the ex-students told me that years after she finished school, she was driving in a car with a man, and she saw her principal, and she ducked immediately, and the man was her husband. So she was just terrified out of like, he would see me with a man. So you have all these organizations pulling people in and reminding them who they are and what they can be. But you also have, and I think in an Orthodox life this becomes really important, you have the streets themselves to contend with, right? Think about the image that we saw before. This is the kind of streets that people have to traverse on a daily basis. And so you can think about this neighborhood as a moral obstacle course. And here's a map of an area of the neighborhood. Let's wait for 1 second. And that's an actual map of a part of the neighborhood. And the neighborhood itself presents challenges for Orthodox Jews to traverse. So point number 5 over there is the house of the synagogue rabbi. Point number 4 is the synagogue. Now, how do you get from point 5 to point 4? Well, on the Sabbath, it's slightly tricky. So point 1a and 1b are pedestrian lights. Usually not a problem. You go, you press the button, it turns green, you cross the street. Of course, on a Sabbath, you can't press the button, right? Because pressing the button is electricity, you can't do that. Well, what do people do? Well, they either go 2 blocks that way, or they cross the street when it's red, which people are hesitant to do, especially when they have small kids, and which actually probably accounts for some of the reasons why the non-Jews in the neighborhood say, oh, these Jews, they just cross the street whenever they feel like it, right? Or you wait for a Shabbos goy to press the button for you, right? For a non-Jew to do that for you. But that's tricky because there's so many non-Orthodox secular Jews that look just like a goy that you don't want to ask them. And also you can't ask them directly because you can't. That's not religiously admissible. So you have to go to them and say, isn't it terrible that Orthodox Jews can't operate electricity on the Sabbath and their buttons? And of course, my Orthodox Jewish friends were mortified to go and do that. That's extremely, extremely embarrassing to just go to people they don't know and do that. So that's a problem. And the same problem is points 2a and 2b. These are garage lights that turn on automatically when you go by them. Actually, it's a very similar story, even though religiously it's more of a gray zone because you're not actually doing anything. You're still operating electricity. And so people have to strategize. And that took me a really long time to figure out because you never try to ask yourself, well, why did people cross the street now, right? That's not a question you think about asking when you're walking with someone. You don't think of asking them, why did you cross the street? But then when I found out, I realized that people mapped the street in terms of these electric garage lights, of these motion sensors. And there's these points 2a and 2b were especially problematic because they were in front of each other, so you had to kind of walk diagonally. And one of my friends in the neighborhood who lived there used to call it my Scylla and Charybdis, these 2 rocks that I have to walk between, which is interesting because it tells you something about what he knows about Greek mythology. But you have that, and these are in some sense, these are easy to figure out. This isn't about Los Angeles, you can think about other places. But then you have the problem of the streets themselves and the profanity of the streets, right? So this red dotted line going from point 5 to point 4 goes through 2 of the main thoroughfares in the neighborhood. And there are starlets that are semi-clad. There's a cafe. There's a bikini store. There is a store that sells skulls. And there's point number 3, which is a pretty famous hamburger joint that sells very, very unkosher food. And the smells are wafting through the air. And what do you do? And so people had to come up with different ways of traversing the street. So the synagogue rabbi, for example, just used to go through the dotted line, no problem, kind of put his hat to the side a little bit and walk as if he doesn't see it. Other people told me in the neighborhood that they have the look at the birdies attitude. They see exactly what happens in the street, but they pretend not to. But some people really try to avoid it very hard. So if you see the blue line going from point 5 to point 4 was the way that the synagogue, the rabbi's wife used to go, and she used to call it the shortcut. Okay, so she would go through the shortcut, which is of course longer, in order to get to synagogue, so she won't have to go through these kind of profanities. Now, it's not that people had only one way of solving these problems of everyday life, right? It's that they had to contend with this kind of impurity. So, some people would go by point 3 and pretend not to notice it. Another friend of mine used to, every Sabbath, stop at the long line of people waiting for their hamburgers, smile and say, "Good Shabbos, good Shabbos." And asked him, what's the deal? And he said, well, who knows? Maybe there's a Jew in line. I'll say good Shabbos. It will awaken the spark of holiness. I will have done my work. So it's not that there's only one way of traversing the streets, but it is that the streets are impure, and you have to somehow figure out what to do about it. Now, this is also a place where, when you're traversing the street, in which hierarchies become really made manifest. So, for example, there's an eruv string, a kind of string saying when it's admissible to carry on the Shabbos. But an eruv string in Los Angeles was a very, very tricky thing, because you have to put the lines in places where you don't have too many people crossing for a religious reason that can get into. One of the lines they put in was on Wilshire Boulevard, which is a very, very big boulevard, very, very busy. Now, Wilshire has too many people to really be admissible, but it's people going in their cars. So people going in their cars, you can claim, are actually in the private realm and not in the public realm, and therefore don't count as people. Now, that makes it kind of admissible to have this eruv, but only kind of. So some Orthodox groups in the neighborhood said, okay, good enough for us. If it's good enough for whatever rabbi did it, we buy it. But others just wouldn't hold by it. Just, instead of holding their keys, they would wear their keys as part of their belts. For example, women with small children wouldn't go to the synagogue because they couldn't carry the children and they couldn't push the stroller. And that's a place where people suddenly saw the distinctions within the community, right? If you saw somebody pushing a stroller, you're like, he is not as frum as I am. I am more religious than he is. It's also a place where, by the way in which people reacted to the streets and solved, in a way, the streets, other people created distinctions with other kinds of distinctions within the community. So one of the distinctions that was always very important is between those people who were born in Orthodox families, what people called frum from birth, FFBs, and then people who became religious later in life, Balei Tshuva or BTs, right? So the BT FFB thing was a very big issue. And people read each other's ways of walking through the streets through these lenses. So here's a quote from a quite esteemed rabbi that used to pray in synagogue there in number 4. And he says, I never go by there. When I come to synagogue, I make sure I come from the other side, which is actually kind of cheating because he lived there. So he didn't need to go by it. But that's okay. I don't want this kind of impurity when I go to pray. But sometimes I see these people, newly religious, going by Porky's, which is how I call it, on Shabbos, going past it. And I know their mouth is watering. And I ask myself, can they stand in the way of temptation, or do they go home and have a little one? Right? Now, he never asks this question of the synagogue rabbi. He never asks these questions of the people who go by there, of the guy who asks them, who tells them good Shabbos. He asks this question of the newly religious, those that in some ways carry their tainted past with them. And so you start seeing how it's not even only the organizations and the way that people move through the organizations, it's even the streets themselves that summon people into being, both in the ways you have to navigate them and in the way that you both read other people's reactions and you know that your own reactions are read by others. And again, that doesn't mean that everybody does it the same. You can have a devil-may-care attitude. So one of these very, very powerful ethnographic moments for me, I was waiting for the bus because I was one of the only Angelinos without a car, and I was waiting for the bus on Wilshire, and there was a poster on the bus stop of a show that was going on at the time, The Tudors. And the show had a very, very skimpily clad Anne Boleyn on the poster with a big cross on her kind of almost naked breasts. And at the bus stop are these two young Orthodox men. One is a yeshiva student, and one looks slightly older. And the slightly older one looked cooler. He had a beard, he had payas, but he had a kind of beret hat and corduroys. And and I joined them and started talking, and they were actually brothers. The younger brother learning in the yeshiva, the older brother coming to visit him. And the older brother props himself against the poster and tells his younger brother, "What do you think?" And the youngest brother's like, "Oh, no, I can't even do it." He's like, "Come on, what do you think?" And the younger brother's like, I don't like what she's wearing. Now, the interesting thing about it is not simply that you have this scene, but that what it tells you about the way in which people react to their surroundings. So it's not really that you have to exactly act in the same way. It's that whatever you do, it's consequential for who you are. It's that if you want to take a devil-may-care attitude and prop yourself, you can do that. And it means that you're a certain kind of person who's kind of flirting with danger versus the kind of brother who's a lot more goody two-shoes. But of course, for secular people, the whole scene doesn't make any sense because the object itself doesn't pose that kind of danger. So walking through the streets themselves is this kind of geography of profanity and danger, and a place in which you can act out different modes of being and different personhoods. So what does that tell us, or how does that help us think about Jewish communities? So I think one thing that it starts to tell us is about how people thrive in an Orthodox, in a secular space, not despite secular space, but precisely through it. Somebody that I talked to at some point told me, when I asked her about how does she like Melrose Library, she said, I like it. It's so stark. This is the Goyische world, and this is my world. And I can see the difference. Right? There's something about the way that they enact their lives in that secular space that make it, in some sense, almost conducive to play out these identities. Sometimes hard, but in some sense this difficulty was almost exhilarating. Now thinking about this kind of summoning, or these moments in which you're brought into being, I think it also helps us think about other Jewish communities and think about religion more generally. So you can think about this Orthodox neighborhood was extremely dense. Like you got up in the morning, you went to prayer, you're constantly called for shiurim, called by organizations, constantly made relevant, made important, and brought into the community. And that was an extremely dense kind of world. But there are other worlds that are less dense. And then we can start asking, how do people manage this kind of moments of summoning in the way that other worlds are pulling them? How does a modern Orthodox community manage the pulls of the secular world? How do you think about summoning in the context of reform life? where, for example, you don't usually all live in the same neighborhood, but travel to the neighborhood on the Shabbos, for the ways in which organizations are located, right? How does that then change the ways in which summoning happens? It tells us something about the patterns of summoning, and even of worlds that are even not defined by religion, but by status or class or occupation. Academics, as I have found out, is an extremely dense occupation. You're constantly called into being. And I think another perhaps takeaway point, if that is more general, is that it allows us to appreciate that this kind of density is not just a positive aspect of community. Yes, it's something, it made certain people in the neighborhood feel needed and feel that they were constantly with people, and not just with people, but important to people. But it also was sometimes suffocating. The very same processes meant that they sometimes just wanted to get out of there, and that sometimes different people wanted to get out, but sometimes the same people, they just couldn't handle it at certain points. And then thinking about these kind of patterns allows us to kind of open these questions. Thank you very much.
Iddo has allowed us some time for questions. You can follow your curiosity about the Orthodox community of LA. And I'll let Iddo field the questions, and maybe just so that people can hear, you can repeat the questions for the purpose of
Okay, sure. And if you can please wait for the mic, actually. There's a traveling mic.
Yes.
In Los Angeles, there is really only one important religious question, and that is, how much does the house cost?
Ah.
So how do these people afford to live in that area, given all the other demands on their income, but particularly the price of homes is way north of $1 million for a very modest home there?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important question. So there's a couple of things. First of all, at least some of the peoples came in the 80s when this neighborhood was on its way up, but not quite there yet. And so they came when these houses were much cheaper, and they were very happy about that, and often they told me about it. That's one part. The other part is most of these people aren't religious functionaries. Some were rabbis and teachers and kosher supervisors. But by and large, these were white-collar professionals. So when they came in, and it is, and they did struggle with paying their mortgage often, but their salaries weren't that bad to begin with. And so that's another way in which some of them managed to buy their house. Now, the really, really interesting problem comes into being when you kind of zoom to what's happening today. Fast forward to today, because the house prices in that area shot up. And that's a problem that a lot of people in the Orthodox neighborhood were talking about quite a lot, because first of all, even if they were white-collar professionals, the chances of their kids being white-collar professionals was pretty low. Because especially if they went to these very, very pious private institutions, you basically learn to be a rabbi, a kosher supervisor. You learn to be a religious functionary, you don't make enough money, and you have 7 kids. So their kids couldn't afford to stay there. And I think if you think into the future, it's not the kids of the people in the neighborhood who populate the neighborhood. It's that it's enough of a draw right now that relatively rich, well-off Orthodox Jews can come in and buy houses. And that's what I saw when I was there. That families couldn't stay, the next generation couldn't stay, but new families came in. So there's 3 questions.
So what about language? Do they use Yiddish? Is that a means of segregating, or is it all English?
Thanks. So it depends. It depends on the affiliation. There were relatively few Yiddish speakers. So there was some Hasidic families, Satmar, Vizhnitz, Hasidim, that spoke Yiddish in the house. But they were very, very few. There were 2 synagogues that catered for these people. Most people spoke English. So there was a question here and then a question there. So we'll go down the line.
Back to the housing. As you move toward Fairfax, there are a lot of apartment buildings. Do these people rent in these apartment buildings?
Yeah.
We did before there were any Orthodox there.
Right. Yeah, there's, to the north especially, on Willoughby, there are actually apartment complexes, and there's some few apartment complexes even within the neighborhood, close to La Brea. Some people could afford to live there. The problem was with the number of children, because these apartments are usually pretty small, so young couples could stay there for a while. But then when the families got too big, often they had to move out. But these apartments actually allowed for a lot more kind of a stretch of income, right? Variance in income within synagogues. So you had in some synagogues both millionaires, which the neighborhood had a few, which were very, very important to prop up the institutions, the organizations such as schools, and some people who had much more modest living. So yes.
I'd like to point out a contradiction in their Shabbat Goy attitude, that you can have somebody shut the light off for you if you are not Jewish. Well, the people who drive the buses also the Shabbat Goy, so they could take public transportation and would not actually violate any Jewish rules.
Yeah, there's a problem with paying them.
Come again?
Of paying the driver. But also there's some people would worry that the driver might be Jewish, and you don't know that. But that's a fair question. I mean, there are discussions about that. I mean, there are actually religious discussions of what is and isn't admissible. Yeah.
Forgive me, but I'm having trouble, having been summoned myself, sort of. I'm having trouble with your kind of bemused and slightly superior attitude. I think that these things that you're describing in a funny way are really beautiful. Like the reason that they go to such lengths to find a minyan is because they want to open the Torah. You can't open the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays unless you have a minyan. And they're like so into reading the Torah that they do everything possible to make that happen. I just want to, I'm upset about this.
Okay, so
the dogs are muktzah because there's a halacha about cutting hair. And when you pet a dog, then it often sheds. So it's not an attitude towards dogs. And Rabbi Citrin, whose house you mapped over here. Do you know that he was in Berkeley? He was the Chabad rabbi in Berkeley. Mm-hmm. He now has that shul on La Brea next to Pink's, and I've walked many times past it.
So let me just. So I think this is an important question, and I don't think at any moment. I mean, I certainly don't feel superior to these people in any way, shape, or form. And if this comes out as superiority, that is not my intent. No. I think they make fun of themselves. And these moments that I talked about, all these moments were things that people in the neighborhood laughed about, talked about, and that doesn't mean they're not important. They're extremely important. Of course, it's very, very important to keep the Shabbos. The whole notion of the Shabbos. All these things that I'm talking about are deeply, deeply moral, in the sense that they for these people, they signify something very, very important about the world. I mean, again, I really, really, in no way, shape, or form want to belittle anything about that world. These are kind of challenges that they face. They make these challenges. I mean, I've heard the jokes. I've heard much worse jokes than any jokes that, or any kind of humorous ways that I've talked about it. There is, yeah, no. I mean, so that has not been my intention by any means. And the rabbi of this synagogue that I talked about, whoever that person is somebody that I hold in the highest possible regard. It's just really deeply influenced my life.
Extraordinary. What did you say?
Yeah. So again, I actually want to just make sure again that I.
Didn't come through.
Okay. No. But. Okay. No. But I do want to actually stress this. All the people that I talked about here are people who some of which I'm still in touch with and whose lives I deeply respect.
In the daytime on Shabbat, a girl from across the street came over in a panic. And, we answered the door, and she said that she needed somebody to come over and turn the stove on. She was watching the house while the family was out. And so he said, okay, I'm coming. She said, uh-oh, there's a mezuzah on the door. Are you Jewish? And we said, well, yes, but not observant. She would not let us do it.
No, of course not.
She could not let us do it. So we had to point out the non-Jews that we felt she could go to. Well, the man across the street, whom I thought, well, I guess he was Italian, we said, well, go there. And the upshoot, his wife is Japanese. And the upshot of that was she said, no, his mother was Jewish. He is a Christian Scientist. She said, but did he go or not?
Yes.
Oh, he could go then to do the oven for her.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and again, I mean, and
I'm going to come to the other side and come back.
I mean, I just want to add for that's somebody that's something that people talked about constantly, and another couple of friends of mine had a problem with the fridge because they didn't turn off the lights before the Sabbath, and then if you open the fridge, the lights turns on. Again, it becomes inadmissible for the same reason. And they had to go to these neighbors and say, knock on the door and say, Jews can't operate after the Sabbath. And again, they told it actually as a very funny story. So yeah, I mean, these things are constantly something that people struggle with. And the problem of having a Jew operating it was actually something that people also talked about, especially in the context of asking people to press the lights. And somebody was telling me about somebody who he asked, and the person said, no, I'm Jewish, and continued running. So that was
Hi, I wanted to say, maybe to the opposite of what other people have said, that I wanted to compliment you on using the word summoned, because I think words are important, rather than using a more judgmental word, because it's easy to see from a certain angle, not yours necessarily, that it seems like a very, very closed down, difficult arena, and also one in which people are constantly judging each other, whether they're good enough, not good enough, and that doesn't go away, that stays with you forever. So that, I think the word summoned was very cleverly thought of in your part. And my question is this: if you had been a woman, or if you had had access to the women that you didn't have access to, how do you think your story would have changed? What would you have gotten into that you didn't?
Right, thanks. Well, I mean, so one thing, and it's partly, I mean, one thing is just, is taking care of kids, right? I mean, one thing, and that's partly, it was partly because I wasn't enough in the women's world, and partly because I didn't have kids at the time, that I didn't realize how crucial this was. But it's also that that I just simply, I sometimes simply don't know what happens behind the mechitza. I don't know what happens behind the partition, and I don't want to presume that I know things that I don't. So that's one way. Another thing which women have talked to me about was their struggles with thinking through the place of a woman in the Orthodox world. And I had a lot of conversations with that. And a lot of women who were very bitter about telling me that they thought that, feminists critique them for not taking the role of men, and yet they didn't realize how important their role was, on the one hand. But also actually being frustrated about the ways in which, to a certain degree, men did call the shots in certain arenas. So that would be another aspect that I would deal with, and I think is important for people in the field and for us to think about. But I just don't feel confident enough to talk about it because,
I've two questions, just a clarification. One is, when I've gone to LA, it seems that the highest concentration of small synagogues and people who are dressed in attire that I think may be associated with Orthodox would be on Pico. Okay. And I want to know if that's a different set of people or a different neighborhood. And then the second point is, if they can't have a TV, do the people have phones that actually have screens that are really, in my opinion, they're the same thing as TVs? Right. So if you could ask that, I'd be curious if you'd address both.
So two things. So Pico is a lot more varied. The Melrose Cabrera is considered the more Haredi neighborhood, and people talked a lot about I became a bit less frum, so I moved to Pico. And people talked about, moving to the Melrose Cabrera was also a way to signal that you are who you are. So that was. So there's these other two neighborhoods. What was the second question? Sorry, Alice. The TVs. Yes. Well, I mean, the TV thing is a tricky thing. So people didn't have TVs in the house. Some people did have TVs in their kind of back houses. And often the reason was that they wanted to see religiously admissible content there. And again, some people kind of tread a very careful line there, told me that they do sometimes watch sports, but only sports. And most people, not all people, some Hasidic people wouldn't do it. But most people had iPhones and had computers and internet. And that is an ongoing struggle, one of the most important ongoing struggles in the Orthodox world today.
Excuse me, I would be curious to know what inside of you was summoned to do this very ambitious project.
Well, I mean, it's it's funny. I feel I'm constantly answering you. I'm really troubled by the fact that you said that I was disrespectful for these people. But let me ask that and in some ways answer you. But I mean, there's a lot of things in it. I mean, some of it was that I'm a secular Jew from Israel, and there was something. I grew up next to the Belz Yeshiva in Jerusalem, and my only contact with them was that they threw stones at my house, and I don't know how they thought about what I did with them, but I had no contact with Orthodoxy. So suddenly being thrust into Orthodoxy was amazingly compelling. The other thing was that this was a world that both made me welcome, and it's an extremely meaningful world, and it's a world of learning. And for an academic to be in a place where we're reading texts and thinking about texts is extremely valuable, is just very, very compelling. I still, and this kind of learning has become part of my life. I mean, the person I used to learn with most often when I was living there, I still learn with him on a weekly basis, even now, and it's been 6 years later. Now we learn on Skype. I had to miss my Skype appointment because I'm here. So all these things were things that were extremely seductive, and I say that in the best way. I mean, there are other things which I didn't talk about here, because they're more problematic to me, that I think are very, that repelled me, I have to say. I mean, I think especially the treatment of the non-Jew and the way that people talked about goys and other things that I think as important. gay marriage, for example, other things like that, that people's positions on that were very, very hard for me. But on the main, it was, you know, it's a place that I still miss, and then when I go to LA, that's where I stay. So.
I have a couple of questions. I wanted to do a follow-up on the question several back about, you said that parents are professionals, but the children aren't. And I don't understand that in the sense that if the parents are BTs, and I'm sorry, no.
If the parents are not BTs,
are not, yeah, then are they raising their children differently?
Yeah. Well,
And if they are, then what does that say about the community?
well,
I'm very puzzled.
So I mean, that has been something that's been talked about a lot in the literature about Jews. What it means to be Orthodox has become more and more strict over the years. So if you look even on the census, 1978 census and 1998 census of how many Orthodox Jews there are in Los Angeles, it's the same percentage and more or less the same number of, it's actually a lesser percentage, more or less the same number of Jews that consider themselves Orthodox. But anybody that knows anything about Los Angeles knows that there were no black hats then, and there are now. That there were no kosher places then that were glatt kosher, and there are now. Well, what happened is that what it means to be Orthodox changed. The people who then said they were Orthodox were of a kind of immigrant Orthodoxy that was much more lenient than the Orthodoxy of today. Even the strict Orthodox that came from the East Coast described childhoods that were completely different, in which they read a lot more secular books, in which they had a lot more secular education. This kind of new strict Orthodox world is really new in a very, very important sense. So that's the reason.
Okay, so second question is, I hadn't picked up that it was 4,000 people,
Right.
which is effectively the size of Stephen Wise Temple. And so I'm wondering about whether you could, in some sense, consider the neighborhood to be, as you're thinking about looking at the contrast between a reform and the density and between reform and not, you've almost got a comparison there in terms of numbers.
Right.
So I don't know if you have, I don't know if that's a comment or a question, but what's your response to that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I didn't think about it in that way. I think, well, the question, yeah, I mean, I don't quite know how to think about it. Are we thinking about it as it goes forward? Because yes, these are 4,000 people, but this isn't, demographically, this is a neighborhood that's growing now. People don't stay because they can't afford it, but demographically. So there's all these ways of thinking how to compare these. But yes, but you're right. I mean, you could kind of, and another question is, well, why do you need 24, 25 synagogues when you can put everybody in one very, very, very big temple? And the reason becomes that of affiliations within Orthodoxy, but also of sometimes of rabbis that finish the kollel and they have nothing to do in LA because the LA is not a big enough world in some sense. So what do you do? Well, opening a synagogue is one way, and there's always kind of a specific niche you can find in some sense that is in some ways needed. So there's a lot of ways in which, also actually because of tax law, once you have a place and you're a religious organization, you pay very low taxes. So it actually makes it possible to have if you own the building, which some synagogues do, even if you have very few members, you don't pay a lot of the taxes. You have to pay utilities, but not a lot more. So that's another. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle.
Did you do any sociologic studies of the Jewish non-Orthodox neighbors in that area? Because there were some fairly famous incidents where people wanted to set up a synagogue in a home, and the neighbors went to the city council and
Right. There was one
vociferously-
especially famous case, a Hungarian Hasidic synagogue that met in somebody's home, and there was a huge question of zoning laws. And it was actually still ongoing when I left. Not necessarily by Jewish residents. It was both Jewish and non-Jewish residents. I didn't do a study of the non-Orthodox Jews. The ones whom I met are the ones who people often brought in for Sabbath dinners. And so that's a kind of skewed sample, right? You don't have the sample of the people who would never go, right? And there were some of these as well. So yeah, it's a really good question, but I don't know enough.
And could I just ask, did you detect any beginnings of religious ferment in the idea that maybe we should allow women to be in a minyan so we can have a minyan, or
no?
Any stirrings of the women in the community?
This is a very, I mean, especially the mechitza, the question of the mechitza, and the question of the minyan. These are questions, in some sense, these are the questions that today define orthodoxy. So actually one of the movement of orthodoxy has actually become more strict in these terms, not more lenient. And never has anybody said, maybe we can have a woman in the minyan. Some people joked about that in some situations, it's permissible to have the Torah scroll count as a person. Never. And actually, historically, so at least two of the synagogues who used to be Orthodox used not to have a mechitza, right? Because at some point of Orthodoxy, it was a lot more lenient. And then as Orthodoxy moved to the right, they had to construct a mechitza. And at least in a couple of interviews, the rabbis told me they lost half of their congregation because they just moved elsewhere. Again, these are part of the people, some people who would probably have said they were Orthodox in 78 and not in 98. I mean, some just died off, right? You have a changing guard. But some people just changed their affiliation in that sense. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for this fascinating talk. The question that I have is, it seems as if the community in the long run is unsustainable because, not only because of the real estate prices, but because the fact is that this is a community that really can't seal itself off from the rest of the world. And when you have lots of children, the children go in different directions. We're able to study what happens to that next generation, how many of them go, in which directions become more religious, less religious, and is there a movement to reestablish the community in an area which is more economically feasible that would allow the community to keep itself together?
Yeah, thank you. These are really great questions. So it's hard to give hard numbers on that because that doesn't exist. My sense is that about 10% of Orthodox children, and that's also around the numbers that Orthodox rabbis gave me, that around 10% of the children become much more secular than their parents. Now, I have to say that in places like New York, they said, people stopped talking to them, and that didn't happen in LA. Did not happen, and I wonder whether the studies in LA that say that they completely lose any contact with any of their family, how true that is. I have my reasons for suspicion that people don't actually disown their children, but these are very hard things for them. So that's, but if you're thinking demographically, if you have 7 kids, 5, 7 kids, and one goes off the derech, right, or 1 in 2 families, in terms of the demographically, the community is only getting bigger, and you can see that happening over the last decades. There was an idea when I was there of having a place quite far off in the valley and establishing a Jewish community there. And people were talking about it. People were talking with the real estate, like large real estate agents, but nothing came out of it that I know of, at least then. Now, in terms of the viability of the neighborhood, again, I don't know. It's unviable if you're thinking about the children staying where their parents were. But in my time in the neighborhood, I saw more and more people who could afford to buy a house. So the neighborhood is becoming more and more upper class, right, in terms of the people who come in. But it's constantly shifting in terms of the demographic of the actual people, right? So there's a difference between the neighborhood surviving and the actual generations of the people in the neighborhood staying there. So I think actually the neighborhood's doing great. It's going to stay for the foreseeable future. It's going to become more and more upper class because there are enough people to take that. But again, the children will have to go out. Yeah, I mean, especially for yeshiva, people travel for yeshiva. So, there's pretty good yeshivas in LA, but people travel for yeshiva. So people go to people go to to Lakewood, people go to Morristown, people go to New York, and people go to Israel. A lot of people go to Israel, and some of the kids stay in Israel, and some of the kids come back. And that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.